He fixed a leaking roof with his bare hands on a prayer, and then a car with tinted windows stopped like a punctuation mark at the corner of his street. He wiped his palms on his shirt and looked up to find a man in white waiting with a smile that fit a different economy. Daniel Ortiz was 34, a handyman who reset breakers and patched tarps, a son who split every last peso with his aging mother, and a father who had left without goodbye. He lived in a two-room unit above a bakery where the smell of burnt sugar crept under the door, and the roof leaked in a pattern he had traced with a thumb for years. Mornings began with the bite of stale coffee and the clank of tools. Nights were for counting coins and listening to his mother breathe. The house sang of necessity the way a machine sings when it knows its parts by heart. The yard smelled of petrol and dust, the metal toolbox was warm to the touch, and the sunlight on the corrugated sheet burned his scalp when he leaned too long. He felt the grit of the street under his nails, the rasp of his voice after a long day, and the ache behind his ribs that came with work that never translated into rest. The car that stopped smelled of leather and expensive cologne, and it smelled like a separate life. The man who stepped out wore linen so white it seemed to hold light. He extended a hand that was clean enough to make Daniel notice the calluses on his own fingers. "You deserve more," he said, and his voice was the kind that slid into the shape of promises. Daniel hesitated. His mother Maria had taught him restraint the way other people taught prayers. Maria would fold each bill twice before placing it in a jar labeled for medicine, and would tap his cheek with her knuckles when he promised too much. He had memories of lying awake as a child, listening to rain pound the tin roof, and feeling a hunger that summarized 2 decades. He had taught himself to be practical out of love. That night he agreed to go to a meeting with no more than the curiosity of a man who wanted to imagine something softer than his current light. A shadow of a hymn reached him before the church did, a low hum that smelled faintly of incense and lemon. The building smelled of polished wood and a sanitized brightness that did not belong to his neighborhood. Inside, incense stuck to the rafters, shoes clicked on tile, and a choir sang notes like currency. The pastor mounted a stage, palms raised, his suit reflecting a careful economy of shine. He spoke of seeds and harvests and how gratitude required a contribution. He told stories of instant promotions and cars found in driveways overnight. Daniel listened to testimonies full of numbers.
And sudden relocations, the way someone reads a foreign currency that almost feels familiar. The word prosperity hung in the air like heat. He met names as the weeks folded. Miguel, who had once worked with him at the market and who now smiled with a brand new phone. Lydia, a woman with lacquered nails who brought casseroles and spoke of conversion like it was a career plan. Pastor Elias, a tall man with a voice that seemed to collect light, who kept an aquarium full of shimmering fish behind his desk. The aquarium looked more like a small stage than a fish tank, full of colored stones and a single carved blue jar nested like a relic among fake coral. The jar glinted often when Elias walked by, and people touched the glass the way they touched holy things at festivals. Sister Anna, an older woman who wore thrifted dresses and who hummed hymns like a machine. Officer Alvarez, the gentle cop who came to community meetings and who drank from the same cup of blessings when invited. Claire, a reporter who began asking questions at the local paper and whose notes smelled faintly of ink and alarm. The invitation to a circle came gentle at first as a hand on a shoulder, and then with language that thickened into something concrete. "You will be part of a covenant," they said. "Offer your first fruits and watch the doors open." At first the asks were small: seeds, a small monthly giving, a box of supplies for the youth group. Daniel signed his name on a simple sheet that smelled faintly of printer ink in an office that smelled of lemon and disinfectant. He tasted the water the leader offered to him, and it felt cool and metallic at the same time, as if it had passed through more hands than it should. He was told to keep his phone silent and to listen. He nodded and swallowed, and the agreement began to harden. He did not notice the clauses then. He noticed Miguel telling him in low exchanges about an opening in a maintenance contract with a chain of small clinics. He noticed Lydia offering to refer him to a friend who rented apartments at a discount. He noticed subtle speeches about obedience being the shape of blessing. In those months there were breakfasts where bread tasted richer, Sundays where the sermon washed over him like an unfamiliar tide, nights where he dreamt of water and fish and a jar that held a light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The dreams started soft and became loud. In one, he walked into an alley where fish flapped on concrete, their gills scratching at the streetlight, and the jar in his hands was warm and bleeding light. He woke with the taste of salt and tin on his tongue, and the echo of a child calling for him somewhere under a bridge. The backstory of Daniel filled in between the sounds.
Of testimony. He had grown up in a town where promises were often shaped like paperwork, and where men left for the cities and left their names on the doorframe. He had apprenticed with his father in a cramped workshop, learning to bend metal to purpose and informality to survival. When his father left, Daniel carried a quiet responsibility and a ledger of small debts in his head that he balanced by memory. At 22, he married a woman who left 2 years later when the catalog of arguments outweighed the meals. He raised his nephew Tomas for a season and learned how to ward off panic at night by fixing things, by making things work. The loss of his father had taught him an economy of hope that never relied on luck. He believed in steady hands and in making promises to show up. When Maria fell ill a few winters back, he sold the last of his tools to pay for medicines and rebuilt his life around an idea that work would repay what sickness took away. This made him slow to trust miracles and quick to trade caution for a chance when the ledger finally tipped toward desperation. That first meeting with Pastor Elias lasted long enough to feel like a turning point. Inside the office, Elias spoke quietly, his voice always a hair softer than his rhetoric on stage. He asked Daniel about his mother, about the roof, about the medicines. Daniel answered in short sentences. Elias listened and then spoke of an alliance, of being chosen, of a circle that was not for everyone. The conversation widened into a ritual offer. "You belong to us," he said. "Come deeper, and we will carry you." There were 8 exchanges at least between them, shifts of consent and explanation. Daniel said, "I work with my hands." Elias said, "Good hands are sacred hands." Daniel said, "I cannot afford much." Elias said, "Faith is not about money, it is about investment note by note." Daniel said, "What is the cost?" Elias said, "Commitment and presence first." Daniel said, "Then what next?" "A covenant and a giving." Daniel said, "Does it change things right away?" Elias said, "Sometimes immediate, sometimes in secret, but always true." Daniel said, "And the jar?" Elias said, "The jar is a symbol, it is not the blessing, but it helps to remember." The jar remained on the shelf between them, blue glass glimmering like a private moon. The office smelled of lemon cleaner and the faint metallic breath of coins. The aquarium hummed with the movement of fish, and the muffled sound of a television in another room, tuned to a channel that showed images of buildings and applause. His first visit to the main service was a sensory sweep that unbalanced him. The floor vibrated with footfall, the lights were bright enough to flatten his face and make his sweat show. He felt the hard wood of the pew against his knees, the roughness of a borrowed prayer shawl as it brushed his cheek, and the heat of bodies packed tightly in a ritualized proximity. A woman 2 seats down wept, and when she spoke, she announced a promotion and a flight booked in a week, the way someone announces a new address. The choir sang about planting and harvest, and the pastor spoke of breakthrough as if it were a scheduled event. Testimonies cascaded, and the crowd clapped like a small sea of hands that had learned a profession of sound. A man handed Daniel a leaflet with images of glass towers and smiling families, and the words, "Covenant Partnership," in bold. The air tasted of lemon and sweet bread, and incense threaded through the hymn like a hidden chord. After the service, a circle of people approached him with hands extended and small proselytizing smiles. Lydia pressed a casserole into his hands, and Miguel clapped him on the back. The conversation extended into a fuller negotiation of duty and benefit. They talked about a circle of 12 who would meet on Fridays and who would receive special prayer. Daniel asked 2 questions and received 8 responses of encouragement and 1 conditional instruction. One woman, Sister Anna, clasped his hand and said, "Sometimes you must let people carry you." Her palm was calloused like a map of work, and her voice felt like history. The invitation into a more private room behind the pulpit came after weeks of presence. In that room, the aquarium took on a new role. It was larger there, and the jar sat on a pedestal under a light that made it glow the way a small sun glows on a clear morning. The circle inside the room was smaller, and the language different. They spoke of covenant like a legal document and called it a contract in softer tones. A man named Thomas, the steward, explained the steps you must take to enter the inner circle, and his talk had the steady cadence of someone who had repeated a script with persuasive success. Daniel listened to him while watching Elias move behind a small desk, folding paper the way a tailor folds cloth. The conversation in that office was full of procedural description. They asked him to sign a form that they explained was a commitment, not a debenture. They guided him through a ceremonial signing where ink was offered and a clerk recorded the moment. The clerk used a stamp and a red ribbon, and the paper was placed into a binder with other names. A short legal-sounding explanation followed where they described terms of attendance and the benefits that accompanied status members. Members would receive priority for jobs, referral networks, and access to small loans. That explanation used the language of charity and contract in the same breath. The signature felt like a promise, and the paper had the faint smell of printer ink and lemon oil. There was also a ritual
of consecration that first night where Daniel was given a small cup of water to drink. The cup was cold, and the water tasted faintly of copper. As he swallowed, the leader said that every swallow was a step deeper into blessing, and that the jar held a benevolent witness. The ritual included rubbing oil on the forehead in small circles and asking him to repeat phrases about obedience and opening. He repeated them aloud and felt his throat close and then loosen. Voices came at him in chorus. He heard, "Speak your yes," and he answered, "Yes," and then again, "Healed," and he answered, "I am healed," and the words felt like garments that would not quite fit him, but which he was taught to wear. The first ritual of consequence demanded an offering more substantial than a loaf. They asked him to surrender a pay period of wages to the church for seed capital. He counted coins that night like a small sacrament and placed them in a folded envelope. There was a scene of signing, and then a dream that night of water rising in his small room and fish swimming past his window. The dream tasted of tin and old metal, and he woke with a tremor at his ribs. As Daniel became more enmeshed, his life shifted in slow, incremental pushes. He found short-term contracts more available, some favored by the church community, others arranged by people who nodded toward the pastor with a look that implied sharing of profit. His phone filled with messages that promised opening doors if he would attend extra meetings and refer others. Social life rearranged into study groups and volunteer schedules. The people around him whispered of good fortune as if it was a contagious condition. Miguel spoke of a new job. Lydia spoke of a trip abroad. Sister Anna spoke of reconciliations. Daniel felt gratitude bloom, and also the tightening of a net. Dreams intensified until they became a map of signs. He dreamed of a large room full of jars, and of fish flicking like lamps. He dreamed of waters that threatened to close over him, and of a voice that called him by a name he had not used since childhood. Each dream left him with a moisture on his lips, and the phantom salt of seas he had never seen. Rumors began in the neighborhood. Some said the church was a miracle factory. Others suspected pay-to-play. A neighbor named Rosa stopped sending her children to the church after she saw young people asked to sell heirlooms for fast tracks. Tomas, his nephew, began to avoid the area where the circle met and told Daniel that sometimes he dreamt of the jar and could not sleep. Tension arrived in moments that felt like teeth closing. The first moment occurred when Daniel discovered a ledger of names inside a binder in the office one afternoon when he went to retrieve a misplaced tool. He found pages where donations were recorded with annotations such as follow-up and special access, and on the margin, the word requisition appeared in a handwriting he did not know. That discovery was a cold press against his sternum. He waited and watched and felt the scrape of paper under his fingertips as if it were a living surface.
He remembered his mother counting pills on a kitchen table and the shame of selling his wrench set for a hospital bed. He felt a rage sharpen like a blade inside his chest, but it was tempered by gratitude, people who now nodded and smiled at him when he walked by. That tension lived in him as a question: do I expose this and risk the small good I have, or do I keep quiet and live with the unease of a secret? A second moment of tension came during a closed prayer session where they asked for greater sacrifice. The leader asked members to pledge land titles in original documents as a sign of deeper faith. A woman sobbed openly and handed over papers that looked old and fragile. The ritual demanded signatures that would make the documents transfer in the future, and the room hummed with the sound of pens scratching. Daniel felt his hands tremble at the sight. He thought of his mother without her medication and of the mortgage that hung like a rumor above their home. He stood and left before they called his name to present a document, and outside, the night air tasted antiseptic and cold. A third moment of tension arrived when Claire, the reporter, called with a question that landed like a small grenade. She had heard whispers of legal complaints and asked if Daniel would speak. The offer of exposure was tempting because it might free others and might shine light on payments and transfers that looked suspicious. But publicity could also cut the fragile network of help he had found. Claire asked again and again, and Daniel put her call on hold because when he imagined his mother with no roof, he saw a different kind of failure. The weight of obligations pressed heavy as iron. He began to dream of the jar cracking and of fish gasping on dry tiles. The ritual that became the climax required something more literal. The circle had its rites, and its apex involved a night of consecration where members were asked to leave behind symbolic items. One participant was told to burn a garment representing past shame. Another was asked to place a lock of hair in the jar. At the center of the night, the leader called for a deeper move. "We must pay the true price," he said, and his voice folded the room. They asked for a portion of property rights or for membership guarantees that bound families and futures to the organization. The request arrived as a ceremonial contract in a piece of paper bigger than those signed before. Was brought to the table. Attendance that night was by invitation only, and the room smelled like old paper and the heavy metallic tang of nerves. Inside the ceremony, there were chants and the slapping of palms and the hiss of candles. The aquarium flashed in the dim light, and the jar reflected faces like moons in water. They did not physically demand blood, but used the language of sacrifice and used stories to soften the ask. A member recited a testimony of how surrendering a shop had yielded a new building. Another described a distant cousin who had received a job placement that changed a family. The ritual tightened, and at its height, they asked Daniel to sign a document that effectively transferred a small claim on his mother's modest property to a trust administered by the church in return for a promise of care. The paper required him to sign under pressure, and it smelled faintly of lemon oil and printer toner. He felt the pen heavy in his hand and his throat thick. He looked at Maria in the front row, whose hands were folded in prayer and who wore a dress she had saved to wear to this very service. Her lips were moving in a prayer he had taught himself to echo as a child. Voices filled the small room, and a set of 8 to 10 exchanges rippled between Daniel and the leader and those who stood behind the leader. Daniel said, "I cannot give my mother's title." The leader said, "Trust is the gateway." Daniel said, "This is too much." The leader said, "Sometimes we must remove anchors to rise." Daniel said, "I have no other roof to offer." The leader said, "The trust will protect you." Daniel said, "How is this different from losing it?" The leader said, "The covenant transcends property." Daniel said, "Then what guarantees do I have?" The leader said, "Faith is the guarantee." Daniel said, "Faith has kept us hungry before." The leader said, "Then bring your hunger and it will be fed." Daniel's hand trembled as he signed, and the pen left a thick black line,
and in his mouth the taste of copper returned like a bad coin. Afterwards, the situation fractured like glass. Some members celebrated that a deep covenant had been achieved and that the seed of commitment had borne proof. Others stepped away in quiet confusion. Maria returned to the unit and clutched a small photocopied paper and began to cough more often. The medicine dwindled. The small clinic contract that Miguel had promised suddenly vanished when the clinic management complained of administrative irregularities. Daniel found himself with fewer hours and with a growing pile of anonymous messages that suggested he had made a bad bargain. He experienced sudden sickness with a fever that no doctor could attribute to infection, and his hands shook when he tried to solder a loose wire. The community divided. Rosa and a group of
neighbors started a whispered petition demanding transparency. Officer Alvarez visited more than once and took notes, and later handed Daniel a business card with a number to call if he had concerns. A local attorney referred by Claire offered to look at the documents and explained in legalese about trusts and about how transfers without full disclosure could be contested. The legal description was precise and technical and included references to statutory notice requirements and to the filing of a notice of contest, which, if executed, could freeze transfer actions for a period of time. The attorney recommended obtaining certified copies of the original property titles and suggested a motion to challenge any transfer effected under alleged duress. It read like a procedure designed to untangle tape from a wound, and it required time and money Daniel did not have. The pressure mounted into a point of near collapse when the workshop where he worked was consumed by flames in the small hours. The fire started in an adjacent store and leapt through an outlet. Daniel woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of glass imploding. He ran outside with his chest hot and fingers scorched and watched metal tools warp and fall into glowing heaps. The community gathered with buckets and blankets and with prayers that tasted like ash. Someone whispered that the insurance claim might not pay because the policy had lapsed, and someone else pointed to a loose wire that might have been sabotaged. The fire left soot in his hair and a new kind of empty in his hands. When the trouble deepened, a woman named Claire, the journalist, returned with a certainty that felt like headlights at night. She had been following the pattern of donations and property movements, and her notes suggested a pattern of persuasion that edged into coercion. She interviewed members in hushed cafes and gathered testimonies from people who had given more than they could afford in hopes of immediate relief. Her articles were careful and used conditional language, but they reached the ears of city officials and of a municipal inspector who began to probe the records. The investigation was procedural and involved a collection of bank statements and of minutes of meetings and the formal request for the lists of trust members. It also required sworn affidavits from those who claimed they had been misled. The process took time, and though the state office moved to request documentation, the church responded with a legal team and with countersuits for defamation. As the legal and communal pressure rose, Daniel considered escape. He met with Sister Anna at dusk in a small kitchen where the radio droned and the smell of stew lingered. She poured coffee and looked at him in that old way that said, "Remember who you are." She said that leaving would be a kind of resurrection, and that rescue sometimes begins with a single step away. Her voice was soft and unadorned. He packed a small bag, and in the small hours of a rainless morning, he and Tomas left the unit for a temporary shelter arranged by neighbors. The rain of judgment and the rain of actual storms seemed to alternate, and both left him damp with exhaustion. The months that followed became a map of small salvations and sustained threats. 1 month later, Daniel had a room donated at a community center, and a small fund was started by neighbors to replace basic tools. He worked odd hours and rebuilt a desk from salvaged metal and sold minor fixes for cash. He went to court to sign affidavits and to give his account to investigators. He sat in a sterile office where a municipal official explained under oath how the complaint would be processed, how civil remedies could seek restitution, and how criminal inquiries might be opened if coercion was proved. The sound of stamped papers and the smell of institutional coffee became the rhythm of his days for weeks. The work was procedural and meticulous, and it took the kind of patience he had thought he did not possess. 3 months later, the city had frozen certain assets pending review, and the article Claire wrote had stirred others to come forward. Some members recanted their testimonies, saying they had acted under pressure. People like Miguel avoided Daniel and then returned with a sheepish apology that tasted of guilt and of self-preservation. Maria was thinner, but she smiled more often when neighbors brought food and when Sister Anna sat by the bed and hummed. Tomas took odd jobs and taught himself to solder by watching what remained in the community shed. A small women's collective organized a fundraiser, and with the money, they bought a set of basic medical supplies that helped with Maria's recurring cough. 6 months on, Daniel had a repaired workbench thanks to donations and to a modest microloan from a community cooperative. He had started teaching small classes in basic electrical repair at the center and found a sense of purpose in helping others keep their small businesses going. The legal matter remained unresolved, but the audit had revealed irregularities in the handling of funds, and the municipal office had issued a public notice of inquiry into the church's internal practices. Claire wrote another piece and included interviews that spoke of coercion and of the moral complexity of institutions that blur the line between help and obligation. The church reorganized and moved parts of its operations to another building, and Pastor Elias issued a statement promising reform and transparency. Many members stood by him, citing miraculous moments and personal uplift. Others left and joined support groups to heal. The long-term aftershocks were not all tidy. Daniel recovered pieces of his life, but the scar of signing the contract remained. He regained sleep and the ability to joke again, but sometimes he woke with the phantom taste of copper and with the echo of the Verna.
Jars reflection in his mind. Maria's cough became a companion rather than an acute danger, and she learned to plant small herbs on the rooftop that smelled of lemon and thyme. Tomas finished a short apprenticeship and found stable work with a small contractor who preferred honesty over speed. Lydia remained estranged, and Miguel left the city for work elsewhere, his absence an apology with no voice. At the 6-month mark, the community had formed a watchdog group and established a small legal fund to aid those who believed they had been exploited. Officer Alvarez retired shortly after and moved to a quieter town, though he kept in touch and brought books for the community center. Claire's reporting had led to the expansion of an investigative unit at the local paper, and she continued to follow the story with a keen insistence that blurred the line between journalism and advocacy. The jar itself disappeared from public view after the audit and reappeared later in footage as an exhibit piece in a legal hearing. It glowed less than, sterile under courtroom lights. Daniel learned to tell his story with a steady cadence, teaching others not only how to solder wires, but how to read a contract. He taught a small curriculum that included practical legal literacy, and community members came to learn what to watch for when doors opened with promises. Organizations offered workshops about predatory practices and how to verify charitable structures. The neighbors had rebuilt a little of the trust that had frayed and put a small plaque on the community center that read in simple letters, "Be careful with promises," and in smaller text, "Remember to ask for receipts." The ending was not a full closure, and that was the point. He recovered pieces, but the cost remained attached like a loose thread at the hem. Sometimes when Maria slept, she muttered about lights and fish and the jar. Sometimes Daniel found himself tracing the line where ink had pooled on the paper he had signed and feeling a tide of regret. Yet he had also found an unexpected form of wealth in work he could do with dignity, and in a neighborhood that gathered around the vulnerable to fix what institutional promises had broken. 1 month later, they had a small celebration at the center, and Maria served stew. She laughed in a way that folded the room, and Daniel realized he had not heard that laugh in a long time. 3 months later, a legal settlement returned a small sum to members who proved duress, and the church was required to post annual audits. 6 months later, Daniel taught a workshop and watched a room of people take notes with earnest faces, their pens clacking like small tools of repair. The jar had lost its glow, but the lessons it taught echoed. People in the neighborhood told the story differently. Some called Daniel naive and insisted that faith had been misattributed. Others called him brave for stepping forward.
Claire published a follow-up that read like an admonition and an ode. Sister Anna moved to a smaller house, but kept her faith and kept visiting the center for the soup and the quiet. Pastor Elias resigned from the public ministry and later appeared in court to answer questions about oversight and consent. The city issued new guidelines for nonprofits and for religious institutions that accepted donations, and those regulations saved others a similar grief. He learned to live with a kind of ambiguous victory, which felt like a victory because it left him standing, and because it taught him that community could be a net and not a cage. The threat remained, in the way a shadow remains after a light moves, and he watched for signs and taught others to watch too. In his dreams, the jar sometimes called, and in waking, he sometimes found himself tasting a ghost of copper. He learned to answer those calls with practical steps and with a stubborn insistence on paperwork. If you want to see another story about how power and faith braid together, and about people who learn to untangle them, click on the next video and subscribe to follow others who recover and rebuild.